If there is one thing that simultaneously sustained and repeatedly destroyed Chinese empires, it was not armies, not land, not gold, it was salt. The most unremarkable substance in any kitchen played a role across 2,000 years of Chinese history that most people have never noticed. It was the empire's most reliable source of revenue and its most dangerous breeding ground for rebellion. The force that broke the Tang Dynasty beyond recovery came from the underground world of salt. One of the most powerful regional forces in the late Yuan dynasty, Zhang Shicheng, built his power on the private salt trade. This was not coincidence, it was structure. The story begins with Emperor Wu of Han. His wars against the Xiongnu had emptied the treasury, and he needed new revenue. His minister, Song Hongyan, proposed a solution: a state monopoly on salt and iron. The government would control all production and sale of salt, and every person in the empire would be required to purchase it through official channels. The brilliance of this design lay in the nature of salt itself. It is a necessity of human survival, consumed daily by every person, regardless of status, with demand that is completely inelastic, impossible to substitute, and impossible to forgo. Monopolizing salt was equivalent to imposing an inescapable consumption tax on every individual in the country, and the cost of collection was remarkably low. There was no need to go door to door. The government only had to control a handful of salt fields and transport routes. The court even convened a formal debate between scholars and officials over the merits and dangers of this policy, an event recorded in history as the Discourse on Salt and Iron. Supporters called it a guarantee of national security. Opponents called it a hidden tax on the people. That debate, held over 2,000 years ago, was in essence the same argument that plays out today whenever a government considers monopolizing a critical resource. Once established, the system became the empire's lifeline. In the late Tang Dynasty, the Anlushan rebellion nearly bankrupted the state. The empire managed to survive in large part because of revenue generated by Liu Yan's reform of the salt administration. Salt taxes became the single most dominant source of government income. The Song dynasty relied on salt profits to underwrite its enormous military expenditures. By the Qing dynasty, salt merchants in the Lianghuai region had accumulated wealth rivaling the national treasury, and the prosperity of Yangzhou was built largely on salt profits. Most people assume that empires ran on land taxes, but at many critical moments across multiple dynasties, what actually kept the empire alive was salt. But a monopoly that creates profit also creates a permanent black market. When the price of official salt was artificially inflated by corruption and layers of surcharges beyond a certain point, private salt was no longer a choice, it was an alternative system that inevitably emerged. The private salt trade was not simply buying and selling. It required production, transport, distribution, and armed protection. In essence, a complete underground economy. Salt did not directly create rebellion. What it provided was an entire infrastructure that could be rapidly converted into one, capital, networks, organizational capacity, and experience with unofficial armed force. When government corruption reached a critical level and popular resentment built to a breaking point, the people who controlled this infrastructure would transform from merchants into leaders. Huang Chao was the most extreme example. He was born into a family of salt traders and grew up inside the private salt network. As a young man, he sat for the imperial civil service examination and failed. He wrote a poem whose meaning was roughly this: "When my day comes, I will make every flower bow before me." A salt trader's son first tried to rise through the system's official track, and when that failed, he turned to the world he knew best, the underground network of salt. That network gave him funding, connections, and an army that could expand rapidly. In 880, he led a massive rebel force into Chang'an. The power that shattered the Tang Dynasty had grown out of the underground economy of salt, the same script repeated in later dynasties. In the final years of the Yuan, Zhang Shicheng rose to power through the private salt trade, and similar underground economic networks supported multiple anti-Yuan forces. Zhuhai Wenjiang ultimately prevailed and founded the Ming Dynasty. One of the first things he did after taking the throne was re-establish the state salt monopoly. A man who had risen from the ruins of an old order immediately rebuilt that order's core fiscal instrument. The Ming designed the salt certificate system, which exchanged military grain transport for salt trading licenses, binding salt revenue directly to military supply in an attempt to make the system more controllable. But over time, corruption returned. Salt certificates were hoarded by the powerful, prices surged, and private salt flooded the market once again. Monopoly created profit, profit attracted power, power produced corruption, corruption spawned black markets, and black markets incubated rebellion. Every dynasty walked the same path to the end. Why could this cycle not be broken in 2,000 years? Because the salt monopoly was something no empire could afford to give up. Abandoning it meant abandoning the most stable source of revenue. Without revenue, there could be no army, and without an army, there could be no unity. So every new dynasty rebuilt the monopoly system, even when it had risen to power by breaking the previous one. The system had the capacity to reboot, but not to upgrade, because upgrading meant relinquishing control, and control was the very premise on which the system existed. The story of salt appears on the surface to be the history of a commodity. In reality, it is the eternal dilemma of monopolizing a necessity. Whenever any system chooses to monopolize something that no one can live without, it gains the most reliable revenue stream imaginable, while simultaneously burying beneath its own feet an underground market that never stops growing. The more corrupt the official channel becomes, the more the underground market thrives. The more the underground market thrives, the more likely it is to produce a force capable of challenging the system itself. This logic did not exist only in saltfields 2,000 years ago. In any era, when an irreplaceable resource is monopolized and the efficiency of that monopoly begins to decline, the same structure reappears. The story of salt is over, but the logic of salt has never gone out of date.